All right, let's get started. It is 3:46 now, and I just want to say thank you so much to everybody who has taken time out of their day to come and join us for this class. We have a broad cross-section of students, of alumni. We have people from universities, Mitchell Hamlin School of Law. We have people from University of Wisconsin, Ohio University, University of Illinois. We have people from the legal profession who are joining us from various law firms and various organizations, research organizations like Rise Research, the Hoff-Berry attorneys, the Nealon Johnson Lewis Law Firm, Blue Cross of Minnesota, Stinson LLP, people from the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis, Red Wing Public Schools, and many, many others. I want to thank all of you for coming. We have some nonprofits here: Minnesota Justice Foundation, Minnesota Justice Research Center, the League of Minnesota Cities. And I am heartened, enlivened, and thankful for all of your interest. I want to give a special thanks to those prospective law students who are joining us. We have a few of those. We have a few undergrads who are joining us as well. Thank you to the Humphrey Fellows. I spoke with you guys last week. It's nice to have you back. And I also want to give a special thanks to the students in my class for working with me to open up our class to the public. For those of you who are in my class, could you just give a quick thumbs up in your reaction so everybody knows who you are, that these are the seasoned veterans who are now in the 7th, 8th week of class now. So it is great to have you. And I'm looking forward to our conversation and discussion today. I want to give a special thanks to the Human Rights Center. Without the Human Rights Center, we wouldn't have been able to do this at all. They provided the support, logistics, and everything in between putting this on. So a big, big thanks goes out to Fanula Nealon, Amanda Lyons, and Emily Haig-Wynn for putting this all together. They will be helping us throughout the class and have done a fantastic job. And I'd also like to thank the law school and Dean Jenkins for making all of this possible as well. Before we get started, I want to say a few words about the course, where we've been, where we're headed, just to bring everybody up to speed and give a brief overview of the kind of things that we explore and focus on in the course. I'll turn it over to Dr. Statz, who will be talking to us about her research. And then we'll take a break. I will, after about a 5-minute break, we'll come back and we will do some question and answer. I'll start that off, and then the audience can jump in to ask Dr. Statz if you guys have any questions for her. And then in the final part of the class, we're going to ask you guys some questions to reflect on, and are very interested in hearing your thoughts. Now, I want to just preface this by saying that when we engage in discussion, when we are asking you for questions, when you're asking questions, one of the things that is really important to Professor Statz, to me, to the Human Rights Center, and we've already talked about this amongst ourselves quite a lot, and that is, we want the information flow to be going both ways. We are going to be talking about our research, we're going to be talking about our ideas, but a big part of this, opening up the class to the public, is to hear from the public and get ideas circulating within our conversation that we otherwise wouldn't have access to. We live in a moment in which there is a great deal of change and a great deal of uncertainty all around us. I mean, in any newspaper, on any day in the last year, last 2 years, 3 years, there are big questions about where we are headed as a society and what we need to do in order to solve the problems, the many, many, many problems that seem to be proliferating without end. How to address those when we, one, can't seem to agree with any level of confidence about how we should be approaching these really, really difficult problems that we need to solve. And that is one of the topics, one of the features of this course, and that is we have a series of problems that we need to solve, and so many of them are based on rights conflicts. That is when you have one party, one person claiming a right. That is a foundation of our system of government, a foundation of our system of justice. But when you have another person claiming a right that ends up being oftentimes a zero-sum game in which if I get my right, you necessarily don't get your right. And rights are so tied with identity. So what happens in so many of our rights conflicts, you think about abortion, you think about religion in schools, you think about Second Amendment gun debates. If it becomes the case that somebody gets that right, part of the identity of the other party that's fighting for their right that conflicts with the others is effaced, it is denigrated. And we come to an impasse with a lot of these rights conflicts. And so what my class and I have been doing all summer is investigating rights conflicts and trying to figure out if there are other ways to deal with them, other ways to solve some of these seemingly intractable problems besides just butting our heads up against each other in these zero-sum conflicts. Now, this is a course in which we engage in a lot of abstract thought. It's a course in which we do a lot of talking and a lot of thinking. This is not a course in which I transfer information or transfer facts for you to write down and memorize. I say to my students, if you can take half a page of notes at most during class, that's actually a lot. Most of what we engage in is simply the experience of thinking outside of the box and trying to figure out new ways to think, new ways to approach older problems. And part of that is a methodology that I want to share with the audience today and with my students. I haven't talked about it specifically, but I'm going to today talk specifically and explicitly about a process one can take for solving problems that don't necessarily seem to have answers. I like to do what I call plant questions in my day-to-day life. And that is when something sparks my interest, when something presents a puzzle, when there is something that I'm not sure about, I ask a question to myself, and I do it with intention to perhaps revisit that question at some point in the future when it presents itself again. And so I'll go through my life and I'll see something on TV. I will raise a question to myself. Is that something that I can look up later and study from a rights perspective, let's say? When I think about something that pops up on TV about something Donald Trump did, I ask myself, is there precedent for that? And it doesn't mean that I have to look it up right away, but oftentimes I find myself in a position where the answer to that question that I intentionally asked with the purpose of remembering it at some point down the future comes back. One of the questions that I planted a couple years ago was, in a moment of change, do we have to think differently as lawyers? So for those of you who have been to law school or are in law school, you know that there's a lot of talk about, well, part of what you do in law school is learning to think like a lawyer. I mean, that's what you go to law school for. You learn how, you learn cases, you learn precedent, but you also learn how to think like a lawyer. And thinking like a lawyer is something that unites us all as law students, law grads, alums, but it's also extremely nebulous. I mean, what does it really mean to think like a lawyer? And so I actually started to problematize that and to ask, what does it mean to think like a lawyer? Were the law students back a decade ago, 2 decades ago, talking about thinking like a lawyer? The answer to that is yes. Were the law students 100 years ago talking about thinking like a lawyer? The answer to that is a little bit here and there. But what struck me and really hit me over the head when I was looking through old notes from law students over 200 years ago, before our country even became a country, was there something deeper and more important to think about than simply thinking like a lawyer? And that is, what does it mean to feel like a lawyer? What does a lawyer feel when a client comes in and knows that something is wrong, not because there's precedent that they can call upon, but because something in their gut makes them feel that something is wrong? This really opened my eyes, and I want to share with you some passages from a law student's journal that he took in 1758. This is John Adams's law school notes. We have records of them. They are really fun to go through, and I'm going to read you a few passages with a mind for you not to think about what it means to think like a lawyer, but think about what he is feeling like as a law student and then a lawyer afterwards. So here we are, 1758, Monday, October 9th. Read Gilbert's Tenures. I must and will make that book familiar to me. I see some determination there. I see some eagerness that we often feel, and what I felt when I was a first-year student, that there is some ambition. Next day, Tuesday, October 10th, read in Gilbert. I read him slowly, but I gain ideas and knowledge as I go along, which I don't always when I read. So he's in a way humble. He recognizes he doesn't always get it, but he feels like he's getting it. Thursday, October 12th, examine the laws of province concerning pads, cattle, fences. Those were important things in those days. And read Gilbert's. This small volume will take me a fortnight, but I will master it. And so he really wants to get on top of his readings here. Monday, October 16th, read a few pages in Gilbert. I proceed very slowly. So he's experiencing the ups and downs of being a law student that we've all been there. Saturday, October 21st, rose with the sun, brought up the horse and took a ride over Penn's Hill as far as John Hayward's in a cold, keen, blustering northwester. Returned and breakfasted. I like breakfasted. I think I'm going to start using that word when I talk about eating breakfast. I just breakfasted. That gives it a sense of gravity. I feel braced, as if the cold, clear air had given a spring to the system. I am now set to the laws relating to naval trade and commerce. Let me inquire of the next master of a ship that I see, what is a bill of landing? What is a purser's book? What invoices they keep, what accounts they keep, and goods received on board? He is planting questions here. He is excited. He doesn't know what they are. He doesn't know when he'll have a chance to ask them and find out the answers, but he's making a plan. He's intentionally planting some questions. Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday, 27th to 30th of October, all spent in absolute idleness, or what is worse, gallanting the girls. Now, I had to look up in Oxford English Dictionary what gallanting meant. It is an old expression. And basically, when I'm just moving my windows over here so I can look at the dictionary entry and share that with you. Oxford English Dictionary says gallanting means to make gallant or fine, to deck out in a showy manner. But there's also a side of the definition, one who is foolishly attentive to and vain of his appearance, dress, or manners. A dandy, an exquisite. So he was kind of showing off, it sounds like, away from his notes. But here is what I want to focus on in terms of feeling like a lawyer. Thursday, the 21st of December. Yesterday and today, I have read loud the orations of Catiline. So this is in Latin, it is from Cicero. He says, the sweetness and grandeur of his sounds and the harmony and his numbers give pleasure enough to reward the reading if one understood none of his meaning. Besides, I find it a noble exercise. It exercises my lungs, raises my spirits, opens my pores, quickens the circulation, and so contributes much to health. Now, he got a lot out of those readings. What I ask you is to figure out when you approach it, when you come encounter with it, what makes you feel like that? What quickens your pores? What feels like it raises your spirits? And focus on that. Ask questions, plant questions, and see what becomes of them. When you read certain passages of law, I promise you they will be absolutely dull as ditch water. Okay? Law professors generally don't say that, but it's true. But when you read other passages, there's something in them that is intangible, and it gives you a feeling of promise or hope. When you read other passages, it makes you feel that something might not quite be right. Something might be wrong. Remember that. Plant questions there. Ask yourself why you're feeling that. One of the most important things during moments of change, moments like ours, is the questions that don't yet have answers, but need solutions. And if you plant a series of questions around a feeling that you get that you can't completely put in words or describe, you might be at a point where you have found an area that is a problem that has yet to find a solution. And if you can focus in on that and ask yourself why you're feeling a certain way, but don't necessarily have the words for it, there could be something there extraordinarily important that needs to be focused on. I want to turn to our next section, but keep in mind some of these thoughts, because when researchers focus on an area of concern, it's often the case, and perhaps always the case, that there is an area where something doesn't quite feel right, but we don't have an answer and we don't necessarily have the words to describe it. Our guest today, Dr. Statz, lives and works in that space where there are problems that don't yet have answers, and many of which don't even yet have names. And yet, Professor Statz has been able to dive into that type of work and really focus on the kinds of issues that are affecting us and our communities, but again, don't necessarily have answers or names, but she's putting a name and a face on it. I want to welcome Professor Michele Statz. She is an assistant professor in the Department of Family Medicine and Biobehavioral Health in the medical school here at the University of Minnesota in Duluth. She received her undergraduate degree at Loyola University, Chicago, and her master's and her PhD in sociocultural studies, anthropology, and comparative law and society studies at the University of Washington. And her current work looks at access to justice in rural communities and focuses on how rurality influences legal advocacy, rights mobilization, and individual and community health in northern Minnesota and Wisconsin. She is also an affiliated faculty member of the law school, I am pleased to say, and we are extraordinarily lucky to have her here today talking with us about her research. Before I hand it over, I just want to remind everybody to mute their Zoom screens if they can. And if you could turn your cameras on, that would be great, but that is not required. It's nice to be able to see who we're talking to, but again, not required. Dr. Statz, I will turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you. I'm really happy and honored to be here. And I don't think Professor Roberts mentioned, but I've actually been sitting in on this course since it began, but in kind of a creepy way, like no one ever saw me and I never talked except for once. But I will say that it's been so just really incredible and humbling to listen to the conversation develop and hear students really compelling and sophisticated insights. So special thanks to those students that I recognize here today. I love the focus on feeling. This is a sort of different talk for me today. I told Professor Roberts earlier that I've given, I don't know, maybe 10 or 12 keynote speeches since starting this research. And at every single one, at some point, either an audience member said during Q&A or afterwards, such a sobering talk. And after a while, you just want to be talking about like things that aren't sobering. So I love the chance to share a more kind of reflexive account of what I do and why I do it, and specifically how I do it as an anthropologist. Like Professor Roberts mentioned, I'm trained as an anthropologist of law, and I'm on faculty at a medical school. So I often feel a little bit fringy in that capacity. But many of you may not know that the Duluth campus of the medical school at the University of Minnesota is actually legislatively mandated to train Indigenous and rural family physicians. So the fact that I do work in rural northern Minnesota kind of nicely maps onto that mission. So I do a lot of work with medical professionals, and I do a lot of work with attorneys, and I don't quite fit in either world, but I kind of have come to really like that. I think that it's made for more vulnerable conversations on my end in saying, I don't have a JD. Can you explain this to me? And also on the end of, whatever individual, whether it's a low-income rural resident or a tribal court judge, there just seems to be a dynamic that sort of outsider perspective allows, and I'm really grateful for. So I'm going to present today. I've got a semi-okay PowerPoint. I thought it would be better, but I had kids home from school today because of a winter storm in Duluth. But just to give you a little bit of background, all of my earlier work was in the immigration context. And when I was doing that work, I spoke pretty decent Chinese and focused on the experiences of young Chinese migrants who had migrated clandestinely into the US and were apprehended at the US-Mexico border and put into removal proceedings. And I focused a lot on the public interest attorneys who worked on their behalf. And most of this research was in what are called traditional gateway cities like New York and Chicago, San Francisco. But as the research kind of progressed, I started working more with immigration attorneys in what are called new destinations, even though they're really not. But these were rural and small town attorneys in the South and Midwest. And the sort of contours of their work was just fascinating. And not many people were talking about the experience of rural public interest immigration attorneys. Maybe that's not surprising. And it soon became clear that a lot of folks weren't paying attention to rural attorneys more generally. And I found that it was a really interesting and kind of comfortable context for me to work with. I myself am from a small town, grew up on a farm, first generation college graduate, and it just felt natural in some ways and in ways that I felt like I should pay attention to. So here, let me start my PowerPoint before it gets too late and I forget what I'm doing. Okay, here we go. All right, so I started this project. Oh, why isn't it working? I started this project in 2016 unofficially, did some pilot research in central Wisconsin with Judicare, which is one of just 2 legal aid organizations in Wisconsin, and which I'll talk about quite a bit in, as this conversation progresses. And then when I came to the medical school in 2017, I submitted a NSF grant application and was awarded funding to do a broader and more sort of multi-sited longitudinal mixed methods research project. And I'll explain what each of those things means in a minute, across northern Minnesota and northern Wisconsin. And before I get into that, I'm showing you all of these images to kind of underscore that I regard rurality as itself an intersectional concept. And it's so important for me to say that because I think particularly in this political moment that we're in, the sort of narratives around the rural US do a certain kind of violence to the people who live there, I believe. And this research has allowed me to have really incredible conversations across intersections of race and ethnicity and class and ability, and every person I speak with is rural and has a really unique and complex and expert perspective. So when I'm doing this work, I collaborate with a number of Indigenous communities across the Northland. I've worked quite a bit with Hmong and Hmong American organizers, East Africans, African Americans, and just this whole diversity of people who, again, are rural, but who may not immediately come to mind when you hear that term. So that's the premise I'm starting from, and it's a really important one for me. So when I pitched this in 2017, it was kind of an interesting political moment, and I thought it would make for a really attractive comparative study. As you can see here, at the time, Minnesota was seeming like sort of increasingly progressive, and Wisconsin, on the other hand, was changing in ways that surprised a lot of people. The thing I wanted to highlight on this slide in particular is that Minnesota has historically had pretty robust funding for civil legal aid, and that continues still today. Whereas on the other hand, in his very first state budget, then Governor Walker completely eliminated state funding for civil legal aid. This, unsurprisingly to anyone, was devastating. The legal aid context in Wisconsin is already a sort of challenged one, and it deserved a lot of attention that it actually wasn't getting. So that's how I set up the project. But as I started digging in a little bit deeper, I noticed that there were actually commonalities that bridged the top sort of northern regions of both states and also set them apart from the southern or more metropolitan areas of their own states, if that makes sense. So for instance, as you see here, between 2009 and 2014, Wisconsin's poverty rate reached its 30-year high. And with the exception of Milwaukee County, the state's highest poverty rates came to be concentrated in the north. At the same time, even though Minnesota has one of the lowest poverty rates in the nation, much of this success is generally attributed to the Twin Cities. Like Wisconsin, its lowest median incomes have also come to be concentrated in the north. This is a really distinct change, as you can see here, from 1999, when the poorest counties were scattered throughout the state. So this economic marginalization is really significant. And it's significant because it has profound implications for access to justice, right? It reflects broader trends in terms of the rural US more generally. The Legal Services Corporation came out with a big report a few years ago, and they noted that approximately 10 million rural residents in the US have family incomes below 125% of the federal poverty level. 75% of low-income rural households experience a civil legal problem each year, and it's often, and no surprise to the legal professionals among us, it's usually not just one legal problem, right? There are often 4 to 5 complex and related legal needs. But within this rural context, there's another important factor. Not only is this sort of increased legal need happening, but there's a real diminished number of rural attorneys. I'm happy to talk about this more later if people are interested. There's been a good deal of important work on the topic. A lot of people attribute this to the graying bar, if you will, attorneys who are retiring and not being replaced. It's often really hard to recruit and retain younger attorneys to smaller towns where, again, there is this sort of economic precarity, there's under-resourced infrastructure. It's often hard for a spouse or partner to find a job. And then in some of the counties where I've been doing this research in Wisconsin, the ratio is actually, the attorney to resident ratio is as high as 1 to 4,500. Like there is just such a justice gap, right? There's this thing we have come to call legal deserts, where there's a shortage of professionals in the legal world. So that's really the setup, right? We have increased poverty, increased legal need, growing economic and policy marginalization, and then diminished numbers of attorneys. And I wanted to understand that better. And so I designed this project that, in hindsight, I realized was fairly ambitious and very tiring. If you want to know what it's like to feel like a lawyer, now I'll tell you what it's like to feel like an anthropologist. And doing this research was tiring, like physically tiring. And also it was emotionally very heavy. And in hindsight, I can see now that that heaviness had a great deal to do with the fact that I often felt like I was the only one witnessing these things. Coming from the immigration world, where there's so much publicity, and certainly a great deal of very legitimate publicity around the whole context of youth mobility and unaccompanied minors. And then to switch to this context that I thought I knew well, only to realize that it was often very heartbreaking, but no one knew. And sometimes it felt like no one cared. So one thing that indicated this to me was just the access I had. And I'll tell you more in just a second about what I did and how I did it. But I was welcomed into spaces and into conversations with a real sense of urgency that I've never experienced. Fieldwork is usually hard, and there's a lot of door knocking and cold calling. And in this project, it just felt like everyone wanted to introduce me to the next person because I needed to talk to that person. Like, you need to talk to this person. And that was great for me, but it was at the same time, to use that word I don't like, it was very sobering. And I felt and still feel a great deal of responsibility to then share those expert perspectives. So on this slide, you can see kind of generally where it is that I've been doing research. To begin, I really set out to talk to as many rural individuals, low-income community members, stakeholders. It brought me to some very unique places. So I would work in healthcare centers. The photo in the middle is a clinic at the Lac du Flambeau Reservation in sort of northeastern Wisconsin or northern Wisconsin. On the left, I worked in schools and community colleges, spoke to students and teachers. If anyone knows your way around the range, Bob Dylan went to high school here. I feel like that might be important to note. I spent a lot of time in like basement conference rooms, drinking not great coffee, but generally having a really good time. So as part of this, I did about 100 qualitative, which just means a lot of recorded talking and note-taking interviews with those residents and stakeholders. I did some focus group interviews, not as many. And then as an anthropologist, as an ethnographer, I did a lot of what's called participant observation. I don't know if this, there we go. So went into factories. I hung out with miners on the Iron Range. I did a 24-hour ride along with emergency medical services, and I will never do that again. That was not for me, it turns out. But all of these spaces and all of these people taught me so much about not only what it's like to practice in a rural community or be a judge in a rural community, but what it's like to traverse through rural space, what it's like to live in a diverse rural space. So as you can see here, there was a lot of driving. This kind of gets at the more visceral components of ethnographic fieldwork. I drove all the time. And if anything, it gave me a great deal of sensitivity to what a lot of rural attorneys and judges describe as windshield time. Like you can't charge for those hours when, well, most I don't think charge for those hours when they're in their car. I worked with a lot of judges who, you know, they're in one judge courthouses and some who actually divide their time between two separate and often very distant county courthouses. A lot of public aid attorneys legal aid attorneys will travel 3-4 hours regularly to meet with clients or get to a certain rural or remote court. This is a very standard reality. And it was also one that made me acutely aware of my power and privilege as an anthropologist, as a white woman, traversing this space, having a car with all-wheel drive, having a cell phone, not that there was necessarily reception, but it was a distinct experience. I think it's also worth noting that I was pregnant while I was doing a lot of this driving, which just really added to the comfort level. But I think it's important to note because bringing a kid or an infant along on research is really hard, but it also permits certain kinds of access and certain kinds of vulnerable conversations that I might not have been able to have otherwise. And yes, I did give my daughter that haircut. And if anyone needs very short bangs, that is my specialty. Okay, so in addition to working with, you know, these diverse rural community members, I did, of course, focus on legal professionals. And it's important to me to show you these cool maps because in any legal aid office in the area where I'm doing research, space matters. So I mentioned Judicare as just one of 2 legal aid providers in Wisconsin. Amazingly, and with no state funding still, Judicare is tasked with serving the northern 33 counties and 11 federally recognized tribes. So you can imagine the sort of toll that might take on attorneys, but also what does it mean if you live, say, in Ashland and you're low income without a reliable car and not great cell service, and you're trying to get assistance from a legal aid attorney. It feels very impossible, right? And a lot of people don't even try for that reason. Similarly, this is one of my personal favorites. This is a legal aid attorney's office, I think in Brainerd, if I'm remembering correctly. And LASNM, which is Legal Aid Services of Northeastern Minnesota, does something really well that Judicare doesn't and probably can't, owing to funding limitations, which is they have satellite offices. So that kind of addresses the distance component, but it's still important to highlight that their service area covers almost 28,000 square miles. So again, that rural space powerfully inhibits the kind of access to justice that people might otherwise have. I also interviewed a lot of judges, and this was a part of my research that I did not expect to do. Again, working in immigration, the judges were all, Executive Office of Immigration Review judges, and so didn't have the same sorts of, I guess, accessibility, if you will, to public researchers that other judges might. And so I interviewed a number of tribal and state court judges and have admittedly done like multiple interviews with those judges because they really love talking and have just so much to share. And also did a lot of courtroom observations. I love this photo for two reasons. And the first is because it's just so stunningly beautiful. This is the dome in a courthouse in northern Wisconsin, but also because it's right above a painting of this mythical creature. Does anyone know what that is? If you're from northern Wisconsin, you will. I don't know if there's a way for me to see the chat function. I'll just tell you it's a hodag. It is the hodag in Rhinelander, Wisconsin. You can look it up. There's a hodag festival when there's not a pandemic. And the photo on the left is a courtroom at Lacoutaray, which is near Hayward, Wisconsin, so kind of northwest. And then on the right, you see a smaller courtroom, not the main courtroom, in near Bayfield, in Bayfield County. It's actually in Washburn. So then I worked with all of these different groups of people. But then the thing that kept coming up in moving between these spaces was just how justice was accessed, or how people at least tried to access justice in this very unique context and with so much obvious need. This is a photo of all of the different handouts that you can get in a legal aid office. I think it's very telling. I don't need to narrate this picture, but it, again, as someone who sometimes works with very small children in tow, I know how hard it is to do anything with small children in tow, let alone make sense of legal need and the sorts of options that are available to you. A lot of technologies have been developed from, I think, very well-intentioned people to sort of help mitigate this need. What you see here is advice. This comes out of Wisconsin. E2J author systems are a really popular access to justice. I would call it a silver bullet right now. They're essentially these online forms. Sometimes they're kiosks in courthouses or other areas that generate and help people fill in these court forms based on their answers to specific questions. My research assistant and I had sort of a laugh cry when we saw this, because some of the blocks aren't even filled in all the way with the right text. And I will also say that in Wisconsin, you actually have to pay if you want the hard copy court forms. So it's just a really challenging space. We have an article that's forthcoming right now on how these different access to justice initiatives fail rural community members. And I just want to highlight the fact that many of them are technology based. And for that sort of primary reason, I describe them a lot in my writing and in my speaking as urban normative, which is a totally inaccessible, jargony way of saying that they were largely developed by people in urban spaces with urban populations in mind. So you find a lot of court and legal aid websites. There are online platforms that offer legal advice or help direct clients to assistance otherwise. In places like Minnesota, this would be Law Help Minnesota or Minnesota Legal Advice Online. There are also online legal aid intake systems, mobile phone apps, and texting services, different sort of online videos, explanatory guides, so on and so forth. And I just want to make it abundantly clear that I am not bashing any of these important initiatives, because I've had the good fortune to meet a number of the people who come up with them, and they are so profoundly committed to access to justice. But again, returning to that sort of urgency with which a lot of Northland residents wanted to tell me about this context, I just don't think that those policymakers and innovators get it. I mean, to speak very frankly. So for instance, with the pandemic, there's been so much focus, legitimate focus, on dealing with rural digital deserts. So I talked about legal deserts. There are also healthcare deserts, right? These shortages of medical professionals. There are childcare deserts. Like if you just do a basic Google search, like rural deserts, it's not the sort of deserts you would immediately think of. But a great deal of attention has come to focus on these rural digital deserts, and they overwhelmingly, and especially in the education world, attend to broadband, right? There's not sufficient broadband. But when we were going through all of these different access to justice technologies, a number of them focused on like hotlines, right? Well, just call our hotline. And as a really brief but compelling example, a couple of years ago, the Red Cliff Band and Bayfield County collaborated to erect a new cell phone tower. This was just, I think, in 2019, might have even been 2020, like right on as the year turned. And when they did that, it was motivated by this incredible tragedy where someone could not connect with emergency services because she didn't have cell reception. So when this new cellular tower was put up, it changed the available cell reception from 20% to 80% coverage. And this was like huge news. And I cannot underscore the significance of that being huge news, right? Like I think we tend to miss the point when we focus so much on broadband and internet, because so many of these regions, certainly in northern Minnesota and northern Wisconsin, don't even have reliable cell reception yet. It's something that's obviously really discouraging to me when I'm listening to these conversations. Another important A2J initiative is courthouse law libraries. And I think this is, again, another sort of important but heartbreaking image, just because if you think, well, I work during the day and I have a legal need, but there's only going to be someone here from 8 to 4:30 on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Well, it's not enough, right? And I think that, again, by virtue of that sort of outsider perspective, if I were within legal aid, or I were a policymaker, or I were even an attorney, I don't know that I would be able to offer this critique. But having been able to interview so many people, I didn't mention this earlier, but we also gosh, what's the number? I had to write it down earlier because I didn't remember. We conducted 228 individual and household surveys, legal needs assessments of low-income individuals. And by virtue of that vantage point, I can look at a sign like this and think about it in a lot of different ways, right? And I'm sharing all of this with you, not to like be such a downer, which I know I am with this research, but just to sort of walk you through again what does and doesn't work with these well-intentioned initiatives. So again, there's the hotline. If you don't have a phone, or if you don't have good service in some law libraries, though certainly not all, there is a phone available to connect with the state law librarian. It was really hard to look through our survey data because overwhelmingly, I think something amazing, like only 8% of respondents had heard of the law library hotline, right? So I think publicity matters a lot in this context. Again, these sorts of books are available. A lot of people say, well, we've got computers with Westlaw on them. Like they can use that. And it's just it's such a striking thing because I'm hyper educated and I don't know how to use that. If I didn't have that and was in a crisis situation, I just can't imagine, right? And so probably the biggest takeaway in this side of the research is the fact that many of the initiatives that are aimed to and sort of touted for helping people access justice are themselves barriers to accessing justice. And they actually compound the stress that people feel. And I want to wrap up here actually pretty soon, but I want to highlight that in turn has these sort of unfolding dimensions for local attorneys and local judges. And I'm in this very, very small network. Mostly it's other law scholars who are focused on rural areas in the United States. And we have these seminars and it's always like, well, there's something different about the rural context, but nobody can quite put their finger on it. And so I struggle with that here, but I do want to say, I don't think the readings that I suggested got out to the audience. Hopefully those get to you if you are interested in learning more, but there is a profound toll on local attorneys and definitely on judges when there are so many and such an increasing amount of parties without counsel, a diminishing number of attorneys, and legal professionals who care. I think by virtue of the sort of social density of rural spaces, the attorneys I've interviewed have this incredible commitment. And the judges I've interviewed have what often feels like an even deeper commitment to doing this kind of like intimate hand-holding for the pro se litigants who are before them when they're on the bench. And oftentimes, though certainly not all, but oftentimes that has to do with the fact that these are members of the very same community. There's that argument, right? Like the person before you might belong to the same faith community as you, or maybe you know that person from hunting or fishing or something, or maybe you do ceremonies together, or have like these family ties. But at the same time, and this is, I think, the sort of anthropological aspect and the feelings aspect that comes in, I think that judges share a reality with so many sort of low income, high needs people in their communities that we're not talking about. So that's what this one article on shared suffering was about, which is that judges are witness to and often helping people through these very complex and often traumatic circumstances while themselves also not having access to healthcare, to mental health care, to peers, right? If you're in a one judge courthouse, you can't just bebop down the hall and talk to another judge about what just happened. There's just this profound isolation and this kind of cumulative toll, I guess, for lack of a better word, when many of the same resources that aren't available to low-income community members are also not available to those with more power and status, right? Judges and attorneys. I feel like I kind of zipped through a lot of very different things there. And I apologize if it did seem a little bit haphazard. I've got a website here. I invite you to look at it. I'm doing a lot of different work kind of by virtue of being in a medical school, being affiliate faculty with a law school. I'm really a very, very big proponent of interprofessional collaborations, just because I think so many of these needs, legal needs, are often intrinsically related to health, right? And so many healthcare needs often have legal components. And I also think these are such entrenched deserts, if you will, that if we really want to address them meaningfully, I think it has to be together. So for now, I get to be kind of a messenger in that, but think that all of you and what you're doing is probably where the rubber hits the road. So I will end there and really look forward to questions.